The rain poured down on the busy streets of downtown Seattle as Marcus Thompson sat hunched against the cold brick wall of the Meridian Tower. His worn military jacket, faded from years of wear, provided little protection against the autumn chill. The Bronze Star medal hidden in his inner pocket was one of the few reminders of who he used to be before everything fell apart. Marcus had been living on the streets for 8 months now. After returning from his third deployment in Afghanistan, the nightmares and flashbacks had consumed his life. The VA hospital visits, the medications that made him feel like a zombie, and the inability to hold down a steady job had slowly stripped away everything he once had. His wife Sarah had tried to help, but the man who came back from war was not the same man who had left. Eventually, she took their daughter Emma and moved in with her parents, unable to watch him destroy himself any longer. Now, at 34 years old, Marcus spent his days trying to find work and his nights seeking shelter wherever he could. Today had been particularly difficult. He had walked 12 blocks to a construction site where he heard they might be hiring day laborers, only to be turned away because he didn't have a permanent address for their paperwork. His stomach growled loudly, reminding him that the small sandwich he had gotten from shelter yesterday morning was the last real meal he had eaten. As the lunch hour approached, well-dressed office workers hurried past him, most avoiding eye contact. Some dropped coins into his worn baseball cap, while others pretended he was invisible. Marcus had learned not to take it personally. He understood that seeing him made people uncomfortable, forcing them to confront a reality they preferred to ignore. The glass doors of the Meridian Tower opened frequently as employees came and went. Through the transparent barriers, Marcus could see the expensive marble floors and crystal chandeliers of the lobby. The contrast between the world inside and his position on the sidewalk felt like looking into another universe. He remembered when he used to wear suits and carry briefcases back when he worked as a logistics coordinator before his first deployment changed everything. A security guard emerged from the building and approached Marcus with a stern expression. The man was in his 50s, with graying hair and a thick mustache that reminded Marcus of his old drill sergeant. "Hey, buddy, you can't sit here," the guard said, though his tone was not unkind. Building management has been getting complaints from tenants about panhandlers out front. Marcus looked up, meeting the man's eyes directly. "I'm not panhandling, sir. Just resting for a moment before I move on." The guard studied Marcus more carefully, noticing something in his bearing that suggested military background. "You serve," he asked quietly. "Army Rangers. 3 tours in Afghanistan," Marcus replied, straightening his shoulders slightly. The guard's expression softened immediately. "Marines, 2 tours in Iraq," he said, extending his hand. "Name's Robert Chun. Look, I don't want to hassle you, but I got to follow building policy. There's a coffee shop around the corner that might be warmer." Marcus shook the offered hand firmly. "Marcus Thompson. I understand, Robert. Rules are rules." As Marcus gathered his few belongings and prepared to leave, the building's main entrance opened again. This time, a man in an expensive Navy suit stepped out, talking loudly on his phone. James Wellington III was 42 years old and the CEO of Wellington Dynamics, a defense contracting company that occupied 3 floors of the Meridian Tower. His father and grandfather had built the company from nothing, and James had inherited both their wealth and their sense of superiority. "I don't care what the Pentagon says about their budget concerns," James was saying into his phone, his voice carrying across the sidewalk. "Our profit margins are non-negotiable. If they want our technology, they'll pay our prices." As he spoke, James noticed Marcus slowly standing up from his position by the wall. The sight of the homeless veteran immediately irritated him, representing everything he felt was wrong with people who couldn't take care of themselves. In James's mind, success was simply a matter of effort and intelligence, and anyone who ended up on the streets had clearly failed in both areas. "Hold on," James said in his phone, then looked directly at Marcus. "Excuse me, you can't loiter here. This is private property." Robert, who was still standing nearby, stepped forward. "Sir, I was already handling the situation. He was just leaving." James waved Robert away, dismissively. "I'll handle this myself." He turned back to Marcus, his eyes scanning the veteran's appearance with obvious disdain. Let me guess, you want money for food, right? Or maybe it's for your next bottle. Marcus felt heat rise in his chest, but he kept his voice calm. I wasn't asking for anything, sir. I was just taking shelter from the rain. Sure you were, James replied sarcastically. You people always have the same sob stories. Let me give you some free advice. Instead of sitting around feeling sorry for yourself, maybe try getting a job. There are plenty of opportunities for people willing to work hard. The words hit Marcus like physical blows. He thought about the dozens of job applications he had filled out, the interviews where his military experience had been dismissed as irrelevant, and the countless nights he had spent wondering how his life had spiraled so far out of control. With respect, sir, Marcus said quietly, you don't know anything about my situation. James laughed coldly. I know enough. I know that successful people find ways to succeed, and unsuccessful people make excuses. Which category do you think you fall into? The confrontation between James and Marcus was beginning to attract attention from passersby. Several people had stopped to watch, some filming with their phones, while others looked uncomfortable with the public humiliation unfolding before them. Marcus clenched his fists at his sides, fighting every instinct that told him to defend himself. Years of military training had taught him discipline, but months of desperation and frustration were pushing him toward his breaking point. You want to know about success? Marcus said, his voice still controlled but carrying an edge of steel. I led a team of 12 men through some of the most dangerous territory in Afghanistan. I brought them all home alive. I earned a Bronze Star for pulling 3 wounded soldiers out of an ambush zone under heavy fire. What exactly have you done with your life besides inherit your daddy's money? James's face flushed red with anger. He was not accustomed to being challenged, especially by someone he viewed as beneath him. How dare you speak to me that way? You're nothing but a bum living on the streets. Whatever you might have done in the past is irrelevant if you can't even take care of yourself now. That's enough. Robert Chin stepped between them, his security guard instincts taking over. Sir, I think you should go back inside. I'll handle this situation. But James was too angry to back down now. His phone call had been about a multi-million-dollar contract that the Pentagon was threatening to award to a competitor, and his stress levels were already high. Taking it out on a homeless veteran seemed like a perfect outlet for his frustration. You know what your problem is? James continued, pointing an accusatory finger at Marcus. You think the world owes you something because you wore a uniform. Well, here's a news flash. Nobody forced you to join the military. That was your choice. And if you can't handle the consequences of that choice, that's your fault, not society's. Marcus felt something break inside him. All the months of holding back his anger, of swallowing his pride, of pretending that losing everything was somehow acceptable, came rushing to the surface. My choice, Marcus said, his voice rising. You think I chose to watch my best friend die in an IED explosion? You think I chose to spend 18 months fighting an enemy that could be anyone, anywhere, at any time? You think I chose to come back with my head so messed up that I couldn't sleep for more than 2 hours at a time? The crowd around them had grown larger. Someone in the group shouted, "Leave him alone, man," while another voice called out, "Show some respect." James looked around at the disapproving faces surrounding him and realized that public opinion was turning against him. Instead of backing down, however, he doubled down on his attack. "Oh, here we go with the sob story," James said mockingly. "Let me tell you something about choices. I chose to work 16-hour days building my business. I chose to sacrifice my social life to make something of myself. I chose to take responsibility for my own success instead of blaming my problems on other people." Marcus took a step closer to James, and Robert immediately moved to intercede. The security guard could see that the situation was about to escalate beyond words. "Gentlemen, please," Robert said firmly. "This has gone far enough." But Marcus was no longer listening to anyone except the voice in his head that was screaming for justice. "You want to talk about sacrifice?" he said, his voice deadly quiet now. "I sacrificed 4 years of my life serving this country. I sacrificed my marriage, my relationship with my daughter, and my mental health. And what I got in return was a system that promised to take care of me and then abandoned me the moment I needed help. James smirked, sensing that he had gotten under Marcus's skin. And whose fault is that? You could have chosen a different career path. You could have gone to college, started a business, made something of yourself. Instead, you chose to be a government employee with a gun, and now you're surprised that it didn't work out well for you. The words hung in the air like poison. Marcus felt every pair of eyes in the crowd watching him, waiting to see how he would respond. Some faces showed sympathy, others showed curiosity, but all of them were judging him in one way or another. You know what the real problem is with people like you? James continued, warming to his theme. You think that because you did one thing right in your life, the world should take care of you forever. Well, that's not how reality works. In the real world, you either succeed or you fail, and if you fail, that's on you. Marcus looked at this man who had never known hunger, who had never slept on cold concrete, who had never had to choose between buying food and buying the medications that kept the nightmares at bay. He saw someone who had been handed everything in life and then convinced himself that he had earned it through his own efforts. Let me ask you something, Marcus said quietly. What happens when your company gets those defense contracts? What do you think that money comes from? James looked puzzled by the question. What does that have to do with anything? It comes from taxpayers, Marcus explained. From people like me who believe enough in this country to put our lives on the line for it. Your entire business model depends on the willingness of people like me to serve. And when we come back broken, you treat us like garbage because we're inconvenient reminders of the real cost of your profits. For a moment, James seemed taken aback by the directness of the accusation. Then, his expression hardened again. That's ridiculous, he said. My company provides essential services to the military. We create jobs and contribute to the economy. What you did was just a job, like any other job. If you couldn't handle it, you should have quit. Marcus stared at James for a long moment, seeing not just one man, but a whole system of people who viewed military service as something that other people did for their benefit. People who were perfectly happy to send others into harm's way, but who had never considered what happened to those people afterward. You're right, Marcus said finally, his voice calm again. It was just a job that required me to kill people to protect people like you. A job that required me to watch friends die so that you could sleep safely in your expensive bed. A job that broke something inside me that I'm not sure can ever be fixed. Just a job. The tension between Marcus and James had reached a breaking point when the sound of approaching helicopters began to echo between the downtown buildings. At first, it was just a distant rumble, barely noticeable over the city traffic and rain. But within moments, the sound grew louder and more distinct. James glanced up at the sky with irritation. Great. Now there's some kind of military exercise disrupting business, he muttered, then turned his attention back to Marcus. Look, I don't have time for this nonsense. Security will escort you off the property, and if you come back, I'll have you arrested for trespassing. Marcus also looked up, but his expression was different. Years of military service had trained his ear to recognize different types of aircraft, and what he was hearing made his heart race. The distinctive sound of rotor blades cutting through air in a specific pattern was unmistakable. That's a Black Hawk, he said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. James laughed derisively. Oh, what? Are you expecting a rescue? Did you call your military buddies to come pick you up? The crowd around them had grown to nearly 50 people, many of whom were now looking up at the sky as the helicopter sounds grew louder. Office workers from the surrounding buildings had come out to see what was causing the commotion, and the confrontation between the CEO and the homeless veteran had become the afternoon's entertainment. Robert Shun, meanwhile, was becoming increasingly concerned about the situation. His security training told him that large crowds and heated arguments were a recipe for trouble, and he was trying to figure out how to defuse the situation before it escalated further. Sir, Robert said to James, maybe we should take this inside. Let me handle getting him moved along. But James was enjoying the humiliation he was inflicting too much to stop now. He had an audience, and In his mind, he was teaching everyone a valuable lesson about personal responsibility and the consequences of failure. "No, I think everyone here should see this," James said loudly. "This is a perfect example of what happens when people make bad choices and then expect society to bail them out. This man thinks he deserves special treatment because he was in the military, but look where his poor decisions have led him." Marcus felt the familiar rage building in his chest, the same anger that had gotten him into so much trouble since returning from Afghanistan. But underneath the anger was something else, a deep, aching sadness for what his life had become and for how little his service seemed to matter to people like James. "You know what?" Marcus said, his voice carrying across the crowd. "You're absolutely right. I didn't make bad choices. I chose to believe that this country would honor its promises to veterans. I chose to believe that my service would mean something. I chose to trust a system that told me I was a hero when they needed me to fight, and then treated me like a burden when I needed help." The helicopter sounds were getting much closer now, and several people in the crowd were pointing up at the sky. Through the gray clouds, they could make out the dark silhouette of a military aircraft approaching their location. James noticed the helicopter too, but he was too caught up in his righteousness to care. "Listen to yourself," he said to Marcus. "Still making excuses, still blaming everyone else for your problems. That's exactly the kind of mentality that keeps people like you on the streets." "People like me?" Marcus repeated. "You mean people who volunteered to serve their country? People who put themselves in harm's way for strangers? People who came back damaged and were told to fix themselves? I mean, people who can't take responsibility for their own lives," James shot back. "I mean, people who think the world owes them something. I mean, people who would rather sit on a street corner feeling sorry for themselves than do the hard work of rebuilding their lives." The Black Hawk helicopter was now visible to everyone in the crowd, flying low over the downtown area and clearly heading in their direction. The sound was deafening, and several people had to cover their ears. Marcus watched the helicopter approach with a mixture of confusion and recognition. Something about its flight pattern seemed deliberate, purposeful. It wasn't just passing over, it was coming to their specific location. "That's impossible," Marcus whispered to himself. But even as he said it, he was remembering a conversation from 6 months ago, back when he had still been trying to navigate the VA system to get the help he needed. He had been sitting in a waiting room for 3 hours, trying to get an appointment with a psychiatrist who might be able to help with his nightmares. The bureaucracy was overwhelming, and he was about to give up when another veteran sitting next to him had started talking. The man's name was Colonel David Rodriguez, and he was recently retired from active duty. He had noticed Marcus's bronze star lapel pin and had asked about his service. When Marcus had shared his story about struggling with PTSD and homelessness, Colonel Rodriguez had handed him a business card. "Listen," the colonel had said, "I know the system is broken. I know it's failing people like you who gave everything for this country. But I want you to know that you're not forgotten. There are people working to change things, people who understand what you've been through." Marcus had looked at the business card. It was simple, with just a name and a phone number. No company logo, no title, nothing to indicate what kind of organization it represented. "If you ever find yourself in real trouble," Colonel Rodriguez had continued, "if you ever feel like you've hit rock bottom and there's nowhere else to turn, I want you to call that number. Don't ask questions, just call." Marcus had kept the card, but he had never used it. Pride had prevented him from reaching out, even when things had gotten desperate. He had told himself that he needed to solve his problems on his own, that calling for help would be admitting defeat. Now, watching the Black Hawk helicopter circle their location, Marcus felt in his pocket for the card that he had carried with him every day for 6 months. It was still there, worn and creased from being folded and unfolded so many times. James was still talking, still lecturing the crowd about personal responsibility and the dangers of enabling failure. But his voice was barely audible over the sound of the helicopter, which was now hovering directly above them. The crowd had grown silent, everyone staring up at the aircraft in amazement. This was clearly not a routine military exercise or a medical emergency. The helicopter was here for a specific purpose, and that purpose seemed to be connected to the confrontation playing out on the sidewalk below. Marcus pulled out his phone and dialed the number on Colonel Rodriguez's card. His hands were shaking as he entered the digits, and for a moment he wondered if he was making a mistake. But something told him that this was the moment the colonel had been talking about, the moment when he needed to swallow his pride and ask for help. The phone rang once, then was answered immediately. "Marcus Thompson?" a voice said on the other end of the line. Marcus was so shocked that someone had answered with his name that he almost dropped the phone. "Yes, this is Marcus. How did you—" "We've been monitoring your situation," the voice interrupted. "Are you currently at the Meridian Tower in downtown Seattle?" Marcus looked around at the crowd, at James, who was still trying to continue his lecture despite the helicopter noise, at the Black Hawk hovering overhead. "Yes, I am. How is that possible? Colonel Rodriguez asked us to keep an eye on you. He was concerned about your welfare, especially after you stopped responding to the VA's attempts to contact you. We've been waiting for you to make that call." "Who is we?" Marcus asked, but even as he said it, he was beginning to understand. The Black Hawk helicopter began its descent toward the street, forcing everyone in the crowd to step back as powerful downdrafts scattered debris and rainwater in all directions. James Wellington had to shield his eyes and hold onto his expensive suit jacket as the wind threatened to blow him over. "What the hell is going on?" James shouted over the rotor noise, his earlier confidence now replaced by confusion and growing concern. Marcus was still on the phone, pressing it hard against his ear to hear over the helicopter. "We are the Veterans Crisis Response Team," the voice on the other end explained. "We're a joint operation between the Department of Veterans Affairs and Special Operations Command. Our mission is to provide immediate assistance to veterans in crisis situations." "Crisis situations?" Marcus repeated, watching as the helicopter touched down in the middle of the street. Police cars were arriving from multiple directions, their officers working to establish a perimeter and direct traffic away from the landing zone. "Marcus, we've been tracking your situation for months," the voice continued. "We know about your homelessness, your struggles with PTSD, and your inability to access adequate care through traditional VA channels. Colonel Rodriguez recommended you for our program after he met you, but we needed you to make the first contact." The helicopter's engines powered down slightly, but the rotors continued spinning. Marcus could see movement inside the aircraft, shadows of people preparing to disembark. The crowd had grown to over 100 people now, with more arriving every minute as word spread through the downtown area that a military helicopter had landed in the middle of the city. James was staring at the helicopter in disbelief, his earlier arrogance replaced by a dawning realization that this situation was far beyond his understanding or control. The man he had been humiliating for the past 15 minutes had somehow summoned a military response that had shut down several city blocks. "I don't understand," James said to Robert Shun, who was standing nearby with an expression of grim satisfaction. "How does a homeless person get a helicopter to come pick him up?" Robert looked at James with barely concealed disgust. "Maybe because he's not just a homeless person. Maybe because he's a decorated combat veteran who served his country with honor while you were sitting in boardrooms counting money." The helicopter's side door slid open, and 3 people emerged. The first was a woman in military dress uniform with the rank insignia of a brigadier general. Behind her came a man in civilian clothes carrying a medical bag, and, finally, a tall man in combat fatigues whom Marcus recognized immediately. "Colonel Rodriguez," Marcus whispered into the phone. "That's right, son," came the reply. "I told you that you weren't forgotten." Colonel Rodriguez approached Marcus with a warm smile, seemingly oblivious to the crowd of onlookers, and the man in the expensive suit who was staring at him with an open mouth. "Marcus Thompson," the colonel said, extending his hand. "It's good to see you again, though I wish it were under better circumstances." Marcus shook the offered hand, still trying to process what was happening. "Sir, I don't understand. How is this possible? How did you know where I was?" "Son, when the military says it takes care of its own, some of us actually mean it," Colonel Rodriguez replied. "After we met at the VA, I made some calls. There are people in the system who understand that our current approach to veteran care is failing people like you. So we created an alternative. The Brigadier General approached them, and Marcus instinctively straightened to attention despite his civilian clothes and circumstances. At ease, Sergeant Thompson, she said with a kind smile. I'm General Patricia Morrison, and I've read your file. Your service record is exemplary, and your current situation is unacceptable. James Wellington found his voice again, stepping forward with the authority he was accustomed to wielding in business situations. Excuse me, but what exactly is going on here? You can't just land a military helicopter in the middle of downtown Seattle without proper authorization. General Morrison turned to look at James with the same expression she might use when examining something unpleasant on the bottom of her shoe. And you are? James Wellington III, CEO of Wellington Dynamics, James replied, puffing out his chest slightly. I have several contracts with the Department of Defense, and I can assure you that this kind of unauthorized military action will be reported to the appropriate authorities. The general's expression didn't change, but Colonel Rodriguez stepped forward with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Wellington Dynamics, he said thoughtfully. You're the company that's been overcharging the Pentagon for basic electronics, while our veterans can't get proper medical care. James's face flushed red. Our pricing is competitive and within industry standards. We provide quality products and services that cost 3 times what they should, the general interrupted. Mr. Wellington, I'm very familiar with your company's business practices. In fact, your current contract is under review for exactly that reason. The crowd around them had fallen silent, sensing that they were witnessing something significant. Several people were still filming with their phones, and Marcus could see news vans arriving in the distance. The medical professional who had emerged from the helicopter approached Marcus with his bag. Sergeant Thompson, I'm Dr. Sarah Chun from Walter Reed Medical Center. I'd like to conduct a brief evaluation, if you don't mind. Marcus looked between the doctor, the general, and Colonel Rodriguez, still struggling to understand how his life had changed so dramatically in the span of a few minutes. An evaluation for what? To determine what kind of care you need, Dr. Chun explained gently. We have a facility specifically designed for veterans who have fallen through the cracks of the traditional system. It's not like the VA hospitals you've experienced. We have smaller patient loads, specialized staff, and a focus on getting you back on your feet permanently. What he needs, James interjected, apparently unable to resist inserting himself into the conversation, is to take responsibility for his own life instead of expecting handouts from taxpayers. The silence that followed James's statement was profound. General Morrison turned to face him fully, and Marcus could see why she had achieved such a high rank. Her presence was commanding in a way that had nothing to do with her uniform and everything to do with the steel in her eyes. Mr. Wellington, she said quietly, this man earned a Bronze Star for heroism in combat. He led successful missions that saved American lives and disrupted enemy operations. His service directly contributed to the security that allows you to conduct your business in safety and peace. James opened his mouth to respond, but the general held up a hand for silence. Furthermore, she continued, your company has profited millions of dollars from defense contracts that exist because of the sacrifices made by people like Sergeant Thompson. You have personally benefited from his service while apparently learning nothing about honor, duty, or basic human decency. The crowd around them had grown restless, and Marcus could hear angry murmurs directed at James. Someone shouted, show some respect, while another voice called out, he's a hero, you idiot. James looked around at the hostile faces surrounding him and realized that he had seriously misjudged the situation. What had started as an opportunity to teach someone a lesson about personal responsibility had turned into a public relations nightmare. I was just trying to encourage him to take responsibility, James stammered, his earlier confidence completely gone. Colonel Rodriguez stepped closer to James, his expression cold and professional. Mr. Wellington, let me explain something about responsibility. Sergeant Thompson took responsibility for protecting this country. He took responsibility for leading soldiers in combat. He took responsibility for completing missions that kept people like you safe. What kind of responsibility have you taken? Marcus watched this confrontation unfold with a mixture of vindication and embarrassment. Part of him was grateful to see James being challenged, but another part felt uncomfortable with the attention and the confrontation. "Please," Marcus said quietly, but his voice carried over the crowd. "This isn't necessary. I don't need anyone to fight my battles for me." General Morrison smiled at him warmly. "Son, this isn't about fighting your battles. This is about recognizing that some battles shouldn't have to be fought alone." 6 months later, Marcus Thompson stood in front of the mirror in his small but comfortable apartment, adjusting the tie on his new suit. Today was the day he would return to the Meridian Tower, but this time as an employee rather than a homeless man seeking shelter from the rain. The Veterans Crisis Response Team had been true to their word. Within hours of that dramatic day downtown, Marcus had been transported to a specialized facility designed specifically for veterans who had fallen through the cracks of traditional care systems. Unlike the overcrowded VA hospitals he had experienced before, this facility had a ratio of 1 counselor for every 4 patients, allowing for intensive, personalized treatment. Dr. Sarah Chun had become his primary therapist, and together they had worked through the complex trauma that had been destroying his life since his return from Afghanistan. The nightmares hadn't completely disappeared, but they were manageable now. More importantly, he had learned coping strategies that allowed him to function in daily life without relying on alcohol or drugs to numb the pain. The program had also included vocational training and job placement assistance. Marcus's military experience in logistics had been valuable, but he needed to learn new skills to translate that experience into the civilian workforce. He had spent 3 months learning advanced computer systems and supply chain management, skills that were in high demand in the modern economy. His phone buzzed with a text message from his daughter, Emma. "Good luck on your first day, Dad. Mom and I are proud of you." Marcus smiled, thinking about how much had changed in his relationship with his family. Sarah had been skeptical at first when he had contacted her from the treatment facility, but she had agreed to bring Emma for supervised visits. Those visits had gradually extended into overnight stays, and last month Sarah had told him that she was considering giving their marriage another chance. "One step at a time," she had said, "but I can see that you're becoming yourself again." Marcus grabbed his briefcase and headed for the door. His apartment was in a complex specifically designed for transitioning veterans, with on-site counseling services and a community of people who understood the challenges of readjusting to civilian life. It wasn't luxurious, but it was home, and that was something he had never expected to have again. The bus ride to downtown Seattle took 25 minutes, and Marcus spent the time reviewing the files for his new position. He had been hired as a logistics coordinator for Morrison Veteran Services, a nonprofit organization founded by General Morrison after she had retired from active duty. The organization worked to connect veterans with employment opportunities, housing assistance, and mental health services. As the bus pulled up to his stop, Marcus could see the Meridian Tower in the distance. He thought about that day 6 months ago when he had been sitting on the sidewalk outside that same building, feeling like his life was over. Walking into the building's lobby, Marcus was greeted by a familiar face. Robert Chun, the security guard who had treated him with respect during his darkest moment, smiled broadly and extended his hand. "Marcus, I heard through the grapevine that you were starting work in the building today. Congratulations, man." "Thank you, Robert. I've been wanting to thank you properly for how you treated me that day. You didn't have to be kind, but you were, and that meant more than you know." Robert waved away the thanks. "We look out for our own, brother. Always." Marcus took the elevator to the 15th floor, where Morrison Veteran Services had its offices. The organization had grown rapidly since its founding, and they now had contracts with dozens of major corporations to help place veterans in meaningful employment. General Morrison, now operating as Patricia Morrison, CEO, greeted Marcus personally on his first day. She had transitioned from military service to civilian leadership seamlessly, bringing the same intensity and dedication to helping veterans that she had once applied to military operations. Marcus, welcome to the team, she said warmly. I want you to know that your story was part of what convinced me to start this organization. What happened to you should never happen to any veteran, and we're going to make sure it doesn't happen to others. Marcus's first assignment was to work with Wellington Dynamics, which had recently signed a partnership agreement with Morrison Veteran Services. The irony was not lost on him, but he was determined to approach the situation professionally. James Wellington III had undergone his own transformation since that day 6 months ago. The public embarrassment of the helicopter incident, combined with the Department of Defense investigation into his company's pricing practices, had forced him to reevaluate both his business model and his personal attitudes. The video of his confrontation with Marcus had gone viral, generating millions of views and overwhelmingly negative public reaction. The hashtag Wellington Shame had trended for weeks, and several major news outlets had picked up the story as an example of how some Americans had lost sight of the sacrifices made by military personnel. More damaging from a business perspective, the Pentagon had threatened to cancel Wellington Dynamics contracts unless the company demonstrated a genuine commitment to supporting veterans. James had been forced to choose between his pride and his profit margins. When Marcus walked into the Wellington Dynamics conference room for their first meeting, James stood up immediately and extended his hand. His expression was nervous but sincere. "Marcus, I owe you an apology. What I said that day was inexcusable, and I've spent the last 6 months trying to understand how I became the kind of person who could treat a veteran that way." Marcus shook the offered hand, studying James's face for signs of insincerity. What he saw instead was genuine remorse and what appeared to be the beginning of real change. "Apology accepted," Marcus said simply. "Let's focus on how we can work together to help other veterans." Over the next hour, they discussed Wellington Dynamics' new veteran hiring initiative. The company had committed to hiring 100 veterans over the next year, and Marcus's job was to help identify candidates and ensure they receive proper support during their transition to civilian employment. "I want you to know," James said as the meeting concluded, "that your situation taught me something important about the difference between success and character. I had confused having money with being a good person, and that was a dangerous mistake." As Marcus left the Wellington Dynamics offices that evening, he reflected on how much had changed for everyone involved in that dramatic day 6 months ago. He wasn't naive enough to believe that all of society's problems with veteran care had been solved, but he had seen that change was possible when people were willing to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves and their responsibilities to others. His phone rang as he was walking to the bus stop. It was Emma, calling to hear about his first day. "How did it go, Dad?" "It went well, sweetheart. Really well. I think I'm finally doing something that matters again." "You always matter, Dad. Some people just forgot how to see it." As Marcus boarded the bus for home, he thought about Colonel Rodriguez, who had kept his promise that no veteran would be forgotten. He thought about General Morrison, who had turned her outrage into action. He thought about Robert Shun, who had shown basic human decency when it would have been easier to look away. Most of all, he thought about second chances and the possibility of redemption, both for veterans who had lost their way and for civilians who had lost sight of their obligations to those who served. The bus pulled away from the Meridian Tower, carrying Marcus toward a future that 6 months ago had seemed impossible. Outside the windows, the city of Seattle bustled with activity, filled with people who were mostly unaware of the quiet drama of transformation and healing that was taking place among them every day. But for those who were paying attention, the message was clear. Honor and dignity were not lost causes, and sometimes the most unlikely encounters could change lives in the most profound ways. Sometimes it took a homeless veteran and a Black Hawk helicopter to remind people of what really mattered in life.